Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first official episode of the Black Sheep Tribune podcast. My name is Taylor Gideon, and I am your host. And this podcast is where I talk about true crime stories that you may have never heard of because everyone's story matters. And for this first episode, I'm going to be talking about Marsha P Johnson. P stands for Pay It No Mind. But before I get into her story, I just want to say that I hope everyone listening is having a good day, and I hope everything's going okay for you. And if it's not, I hope things start to get better for you. I hope that everyone is staying safe and able to stay inside as much as possible. I myself am considered an essential worker, so I'm not able to stay home 24/7, and I'm sure many of you are not able to either. But I hope that you're at least being as safe as possible and washing your hands and taking care of yourself at a time like this. I just know that it's been a crazy time for really everyone in our country and in the world right now. So I hope that, this podcast can maybe take you away from all your issues for a little bit and maybe just let you escape a little bit and listen to a true crime story. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into Marsha P Johnson's story. When I first started the blog, I was just kind of trying to look around for a case that I hadn't heard of or that I thought would be good to start off the blog with. And I was scrolling through Netflix and I came across the little title from Marsha P Johnson's documentary. And I read the bio and it said that it was a true crime story about a transgender woman. And I thought that was really interesting because I just didn't come across a lot of stories that are about transgender people. Like, they're not widely publicized usually. So I thought that was really interesting. So I went ahead and clicked on it, and as I started watching it, I was like, this is a great first case to start with. This case is very important and very important to our history as a country. So I thought it was just a perfect case just to kind of jumpstart everything with the blog when I first started it. One reoccurring, theme that I came across when I first started watching the documentary and doing my own research was that she was, like, in my opinion, a very important historical figure, but she still wasn't widely known and wasn't widely talked about, at least not when she was alive and right after her death. Lately, she has been getting some overdue credit from bigger news sources like the New York Times and other sources like that. But back when she was alive and right after she passed away, she was not really well known, and her case was not well publicized or well circulated throughout the media. One of the biggest things that really jumped out to me about Marsha when I first started watching the documentary and in my own research was that she just seemed to be a really warm and friendly motherly figure to a lot of people in the community around her, and her close family and friends and things like that. And that just made me want to cover her case even more, just because she seemed like she was just such a bright and positive influence in so many lives when she was alive. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of just some basic background on her. She was born on August 24th, 1945 in Elizabeth, New Jersey. She was born to her mother, Alberta Claiborne, and her father, Malcolm Michaels Sr. She started wearing dresses from a young age, around 5, but she quickly stopped because there were some kids in her neighborhood that were making fun of her for it. She eventually moved to New York around the age of 17. In 1969, a time when she was already living in New York, soliciting gay relations and cross-dressing were illegal, so many of the LGBTQ plus people in the area found their safe haven in gay bars. Throughout my research, I found that it was commonplace for LGBTQ people to be arrested, harassed, and assaulted by police for no apparent reason other than their sexual identity or gender identity. All of this injustice finally came to a head at the Stonewall Inn in June of the same year. There was a riot that was started by some gay patrons after the police came in with a warrant and an intent to raid the place. It was reported that the police were overly rough with the patrons and even went as far as checking their genders in the bathroom if they were cross-dressed. Everyone was forced out of the bar and 13 of them were arrested. The angry crowd then started throwing small things like chains at the police, and then it eventually turned into a full-fledged riot, and the police ended up being barricaded inside of the bar, and the crowd attempted to set the barricade on fire. The riot was eventually diffused by the fire department. A lot of people credit Marsha for throwing the first shot glass into a mirror and starting the riot, but she says that she didn't arrive to the bar until after the riot had already started. It's also been said that Marsha climbed up onto a lamppost and launched a liquor bottle into a police car and shattered the windshield. Marsha ends up spending a lot of her time in New York homeless, living with her best friend, one of her good friends, Randy, and doing just about whatever she had to get by. Her and her best friend, Sylvia Rivera, went on to march and demand for their rights as LGBTQ people, and even founded a foundation called STAR, or spelling out STAR, an acronym that stood for Street Transvestites Action Revolutionaries. So whether Marsha actually started the riots or not, I think she just went on to do a lot for that community, either way, because after the riot was over, she was really on like the forefront of the gay rights movement at the time and still pushing it forward and basically saying like, we're not just going to let this go. It wasn't just the riot. Like, this is a problem. This is a huge problem for us, and we're not going to stop pushing until we get what we deserve, and that's our rights. In early July of 1992, Marsha went missing. Her body was found floating in the Hudson River on July 6th. Allegedly, the last time she was seen was on July 4th, and she was seen getting into a car with some Guidos. It came out that a witness may have actually seen her in the early morning hours of July 5th running away from two men, but unfortunately that information never made it to the police. After her body was found, her death was quickly ruled a suicide. And as if you're a big true crime fan like I am, you probably know that once something's ruled a suicide, that's pretty much it. It's open and shut case. But once the people close to Marsha heard that her case was ruled a suicide, nobody that was close to her thought that was something that she would do. They just didn't think that she would just commit suicide like that. Marsha did have some mental health struggles and did have a mental breakdown in 1970. And she actually also went away for treatment for a couple months, and she had some kind of medicine implanted into her spine that made her kind of like a zombie for about a month, and then it was pretty much back to normal Marsha after that. There were also some reports that she was giving away some of her belongings right leading up to her death, which is something that people do before they commit suicide sometimes. But a lot of people that were close to her said that was just something that she would always do, because that's the kind of person that she was, because she was that motherly, loving, person to a lot of people. And so it was like, if she was wearing a cute scarf and you complimented it, she would just give it to you because that's just how she was. And when I first heard that, it sounded a little suspicious. I was kind of like, well, because that definitely is a thing that people do before they commit suicide. They give away their belongings, or they maybe throw a big party for all their friends. It's kind of like a goodbye party, but their friends don't know it's a going away party type of thing, or goodbye party. But when I started to think about it, I was like, that it's not that suspicious to me, because my mother-in-law, who I call my mom, but she's technically my mother-in-law, she's like that too, like if she has something that I like or that anybody likes, she'll just give it to you because she's just that kind of person. Like one time I went over to their house, my in-laws' house, and she had this really cute tablecloth on her kitchen table, and I told her it was cute. I complimented it, and she was like, "Oh, do you want it?" And I was like, "Oh, well, I guess," and so then she just folded it up and gave it to me, so I think it's just kind of a mom thing, even though Marsha wasn't actually didn't actually conceive or deliver a child. I just feel like that goes along with her motherly spirit or her motherly aura, so I was like, well, if that's just how she was, that doesn't seem that far-fetched for her to just be giving people things because they complimented them or whatever, especially if a lot of people close to her say that that's just how she was. One of the biggest things that the people close to her really thought that was a good piece of evidence saying that she may have not committed suicide, was that it looked like there was some kind of injury to the back of her head, and so a lot of them suspected that maybe she was assaulted before she ended up in the Hudson River. All of the suspicion and I guess controversy around the case eventually caused her case to be reopened in 2012 by an activist named Maria Lopez. The case still didn't gain much traction until about 2016, when another activist, Victoria Cruz, started looking into it. Victoria Cruz is the main, I guess, investigator or person investigating the case that's shown in the documentary on Netflix. Cruz was actually able to get a hold of the officer that found Marsha's body, and he literally told her to stay out of it, which I thought was super sketch. Okay, so there's a couple theories that go along with what may have happened to Marsha if she didn't actually commit suicide. The first one I kind of already mentioned is just like the Guidos. Maybe the Guidos picked her up and killed her and then dumped her in the river, which wouldn't be beyond the realm of possibility or reason, just because there were a lot of crimes being committed against LGBTQ or transgender people in the area around that time. So it could have just been a random assault, a random killing. It just happened to be Marsha. And then there's the most interesting theory to me, which is the mob theory. So when I was researching this, I was like, what in the world could the mob have to do with this, right? Like, how do they tie into this in any way, shape, or form? It turns out that the mob owned a lot of the gay bars in the Greenwich Village area at the time, and it was actually very profitable for them. It was so profitable for them that they were able to pay off police officers in the area so that they would turn a blind eye to things going on in the bars, such as liquor being sold without a license. People close to Marsha would always say that she was afraid of the mob, like she always had some kind of suspicion or like paranoia about the mob. So eventually in the documentary on Netflix, Victoria Cruz, the main activist in it, sits down with Marsha's ex-roommate, Randy Wicker. Randy Wicker actually attempted to take over the Pride Parade that had been previously run by the mob. And he was actually threatened through a message that was given to a friend of his that said to leave the parade alone or end up like Marsha. And at some point, the Heritage of Pride Festival also attempted to take over the Pride Parade, and they were also threatened by the mob. Even the Heritage of Pride Festival had told Randy to leave it alone for his own safety. At the time that Randy was threatened by the mob, he actually didn't know about it until Victoria brought it up to him when they had this little sit-down meeting. So he had no idea. I mean, he had some idea that the mob wasn't happy about it, but he didn't know that he was being like seriously threatened, and he had no idea that they could have had any kind of connection to Marsha. So after finding all of this out, he obviously feels really bad, and he just kind of starts to think about it in retrospect, and he's like, well, maybe that's why she didn't want to stay home and was out late that night, and maybe that's why she disappeared. So it just kind of leaves him feeling really guilty and just really bad about the situation entirely. And obviously, it does seem kind of far-fetched for the mob to like kill or hurt somebody just to like maybe threaten their friend who's trying to take over the Pride Parade. But I mean, you really never know. Like, you don't know how profitable maybe that was for them, or I don't know all the politics or anything behind it really. But you just never know what people are capable of and why they would do something like that. So maybe the mob did go after Marsha to try to threaten Randy, who, I don't know. Victoria Cruz was actually able to get the autopsy re-examined by a new medical examiner, Dr. Michael Braden. And he concluded that there were no signs of blunt force trauma as far as the wound to the back of Marsha's head goes. And this was actually typical like deterioration just due to her being in the water and being like, moved around in the river and stuff like that. And he also concluded that she was not deceased before ending up in the Hudson River. But at the very end of their little meeting, Victoria and Dr. Braden, he says that Marsha could have been chased into the river, which would also still be considered homicide. And I also think that that's a really interesting thing to think about, because if she was chased into the river, I mean, there would be basically no way to prove that. I mean, you could try, but if no one physically harmed her and no one physically touched her or anything, it would be really hard to prove that someone just chased her and scared her until she just jumped in the river. But it's definitely a possibility. And I also think that idea is interesting because if it was the mob, I mean, that would be a good way for them to do it, at least in my opinion. Because, I mean, no fingerprints, no suspects unless there's just happens to be a witness around. There would be no solid evidence, especially not enough to, like, take them to court and try to prove that they chased Marsha into the river and killed her that way, So, I don't think that we may never know what happened to Marsha, but I definitely think that that's an interesting point to think about, especially in relation with the mob and everything like that. Near the end of the documentary, when they're basically done talking about Marsha's story and everything, another transgender woman is brought up because she was murdered by a man who ended up only getting 10 to 12 years in prison for the case, and it ended up being labeled a manslaughter case. And a big reason why this perpetrator was able to get such a light sentence is because of something called the panic defense. So if you don't know what the panic defense is, it's basically the argument that when a defendant finds out that the LGBTQ victim is LGBTQ, they go into some kind of panic that sometimes results in the death of the LGBTQ victim. This defense was based on an old and outdated term called the gay panic disorder, which was debunked in 1973, but unfortunately the legal system for some reason has not caught up. So they're still able to use this defense in modern day court in cases that are happening now, which to me is just totally ridiculous, but I'll get into that here in a second. But first, I do want to go over the way that this defense is used, because I think it's interesting and also just kind of important to recognize how this is still being used in a court of law today. Okay, so number one is the defense of insanity or diminished capacity, which is basically saying that the sexual proposition by the victim causes a nervous breakdown in the defendant because of the victim's sexual or gender identity. The second one is the defense of provocation, which argues that the victim's proposition was provocative enough to induce the defendant to kill them. And number three is the defense of self-defense. This is saying that when the defendant claims that because of the victim's sexual orientation or gender identity, they were more likely to cause the defendant harm. And I just want to take a minute and just say how ridiculous I think that this is. I mean, obviously, I think it's obvious that this was based on an old and outdated term and an old and outdated way of thinking. And I think it's really, really unfortunate that it's still something that can still be used in today's day and time, because I hoped that we were better than that at this point, but I guess we're not quite there yet. But not only do I think that this defense is outdated and wrong, but also just it makes me disappointed in our system, because it gives the defendant and a reason to basically say, like, oh, well, this is why this victim was killed. It's kind of like scapegoating them and being like, oh, well, that victim was trans, so, like, that's a reason, or I guess not exactly a reason for them to be killed, but it gives them an excuse as to why the defendant did that. And I think it's just ridiculous, because whether you're trans or gay or straight or whatever, I mean, none of that should be a factor in why it's okay for you to be killed, because it's not okay for anyone to just be murdered. And it's also just frustrating because, like, in cases like this with the Islan Nettles case, the defendant only ends up getting 10 to 12 years, and the case is moved down to a manslaughter case. Now, I just don't understand how someone murdering someone turns into a manslaughter. Manslaughter means, like, you accidentally killed someone, or like they got killed because like in a car crash or something, you know, like it was an accident. It wasn't like at the hands of that person necessarily, or like not with intent. And also, I just think if you're so riled up by someone being LGBTQ plus in today's day and time, that it affects you so much that you panic and and think it's okay to kill them, or you just panic and kill them, or whatever. Like, I think you're the one with the problem, not the victim, or not the person that's LGBTQ. Like, they're just living their life, you know? Like, how do you have so much of an issue with it that you panic and kill them over it? And I just think the third way that it's killed, or the third way that it's used, the defense of self-defense, where it claims that the defendant is afraid of the LGBTQ person because they're LGBTQ, and that might make them more likely to hurt them. I think that's just complete, excuse my French, but bullshit. Like, I just think that's totally ridiculous, you know? Like, I've met a lot of LGBTQ people in my life, and not once have I been afraid of them just based off their sexuality. I think that's absolutely ridiculous. So the last thing I really want to hit on in this episode is the point of intersectionality and how that could have affected this case and the Islam Nettles case and other cases like theirs. And just in case you don't know what intersectionality means, basically, so I'll take me for an example. I'm a woman, and I'm also African American. So both of those identities basically cross over to make a new kind, not a new kind, but a more specific kind of discrimination. So not only do I face the discrimination that women face, but I also face the discrimination that African Americans face, just like Islam Nettles and Marsha P Johnson. Except for them, not only are they black and women, they're transgender women. So that's another identity, you know, that they have on top of the other two that makes it an even more specific kind of discrimination that they face. The National Center for Transgender Equality conducted a survey in 2015 that reported that 38% of black transgender people that were surveyed were living in poverty, compared to just 12% of the U.S. population and 29% of transgender people overall. They also found that 51% of black transgender women experience homelessness, and 42% of black transgender women have taken part in sex work, compared to just 12% of all surveyed. CNN reported that there have been 128 killings of transgender people across 32 states since 2013, and all except one were a person of color, and all except one were a woman. CNN also reported that transgender people have an unemployment rate that triples the rate for the rest of the general population. Also, at least 1 in 4 of them will be attacked at some point because of their gender identity. So we may never know what actually happened to Marsha P Johnson, but what we can do in the meantime is we can all be kind to the LGBTQ people around us and try to create a better environment for them, because clearly they're still being discriminated against. They're still being singled out by perpetrators, and their perpetrators are still not necessarily getting away with it, but they're getting lighter sentences just because the victims that they killed or hurt were LGBTQ people. And I just think that's beyond sad. And it's 2020 now, you know, like, when is it going to stop? And when are we just going to try to make this world a better place for them? I feel like they've been fighting for so long, just like African American people and other minorities, and it's just like, when are we just gonna stop discriminating against them, and when are we gonna start trying to help them and give them more resources and more things that they need to be safe and to have better job security and to not be homeless and stuff like that? You know, like, when are we gonna look out for them instead of turning a blind eye to them? So that's really all I've got for the Marsha P Johnson case. Thank you everyone who stopped by. Thank you so much for stopping by and listening to my first official episode. I do want to let you guys know I am gonna be posting a new post on the blog on, let me see what day. It's the first Sunday of April. I'll look up what actual day it is. April 5th. And if you heard my introductory episode, you probably already heard me talk about this, but I'm going to go and highlight it one more time. The case that I'm going to be writing about on the blog for the post on Sunday, April 5th, is about Jada Kyle. She was a beautiful 3-year-old baby girl who was rushed to the hospital in late November of 2017. And I don't want to get into it too much, just because I'm going to be covering it soon. And I also will cover it on the podcast. I also am going to mention her in my ongoing affairs episode on the podcast coming on April 12th. So I don't want to get into it too much. But I just think it's a really important case, and it's a very current case that's still, I guess it's not still technically happening right now, but it's still fresh, I guess. And there are just a lot of, I guess, sketchy or kind of weird things going on with that case. I'm just so excited to cover it and try to give my opinion and try to show as much evidence that at least I could find on what may have happened to Jada. So yeah, please keep an eye out for those posts coming on the blog and on the podcast a little bit later in April. If you'd like to follow me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Tumblr, literally anywhere, it's just the Black Sheep Tribune. Like I said in my introductory episode, I'm just beyond excited to be making my blog into a podcast now. I just think it's great to kind of give people the option to either listen to or read about their true crime stories, because I get that there's benefits to both. But yeah, other than that, thank you guys so much for stopping by and listening to this story about Marsha P Johnson. And if you didn't know about her, I hope that you know about her now. And I really want to encourage you guys to share this story with other people. Not even like my podcast or my blog, but, just talk to somebody about the case who might not know about it, just because I think it's so important. To still talk about Marsha and what she did for not only the LGBTQ community, but our society and our country as a whole. And please come back and visit soon to hear about the next Black Sheep Tribune case.